At exactly 0317 hours on March 25, 2026, the darkness above the Strait of Hormuz was shattered by something no satellite, no intelligence brief, and no Pentagon war game had predicted with this level of cold-blooded precision. Aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, a 100,000-ton nuclear-powered supercarrier already battle-hardened by 26 days of sustained combat operations against Iran, the Combat Information Center exploded into red. Every SPY-6 radar panel simultaneously lit up with a contact density that overloaded the initial processing filter. The Aegis Baseline 10 combat system, the most advanced warship brain ever built, blinked for exactly 1.4 seconds before reassigning its threat classification algorithm. What it saw was not a missile salvo. It was a wall. Across a 38-kilometer maritime choke point, the narrowest throat of the Strait of Hormuz, between Qeshm Island and the Omani coast, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had just executed Operation Hafez, a doctrine-level tactical doctrine kept off every known IHC signals intercept for the past 18 months. In a coordinated action, timed to the precise moment that President Trump's 48-hour ultimatum expired, Iran had deployed 3 simultaneous kill layers, designed not to sink one American warship, but to seal the strait permanently, to trap 2,000 stranded commercial vessels, tankers, container ships, LNG carriers loaded with enough hydrocarbons to supply Europe for 6 weeks, directly inside the kill zone, to turn 20% of the world's daily oil supply into a hostage, and then a bomb. The IRGC wasn't fighting the U.S. Navy. They were daring it to fire first. What would happen over the next 11 minutes and 43 seconds would be the most tactically compressed naval engagement since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And it began not with a missile, but with a sound. At 0317 hours and 22 seconds, USS Abraham Lincoln's hull-mounted and /SQS 53C sonar operator, Petty Officer 3rd Class Marcus Delgado, pulled his headset tight and spoke 4 words into his comms that triggered the entire response chain. Multiple submerged contacts. Bearing 097. The contacts weren't Russian Kilo-class boats. They weren't the Chinese-supplied Ghatar-Midget submarines the Fifth Fleet had been hunting for weeks. These were Fateh-class submarines, 527-ton air-independent propulsion vessels that Iran had been quietly modifying since 2023 with a low-observable anechoic tile, coating reverse-engineered from captured Russian data. 3 of them, running in a staggered echelon formation at a depth of 47 meters, were moving at 4.2 knots along the southern shipping lane. Their torpedo tube outer doors were open. Their onboard fire control systems had already uplinked targeting solutions to shore-based command nodes on Qeshm Island via the IDC's hardened fiber optic relay network, a network specifically designed to function even after U.S. electromagnetic pulse strikes on surface infrastructure. The Fateh boats were not hunting warships. They were hunting tankers. Specifically, 3 very large crude carriers, the Minerva Virgo, the Stena Immortal, and the Al Salam carrier, all currently dead in the water, engines at minimum revolutions, masters and crews awaiting the outcome of Trump's ultimatum. Each vessel carried between 200,000 and 280,000 metric tons of crude oil. Each was positioned directly astride the southern shipping lane, forming an accidental breakwater of steel and petroleum that Iran had spent 3 weeks calculating it could exploit. A single 533 mm USET 80 torpedo detonating beneath the keel of any one of them would not just sink the ship at that cargo density, at that water temperature, in a channel only 52 meters deep. The resulting hydrocarbon fire would spread across the surface in under 90 seconds. The strait would be physically impassable for days, perhaps weeks, and the IRGC's environmental engineers had already modeled the burn trajectory. It would drift east, directly toward the Oman LNG terminal at Sur. At exactly 0318 hours, the second kill layer activated. 14 Shahid 195 loitering munitions, the export-banned naval variant of the Shahid 136, fitted with an active radar seeker optimized for large displacement surface targets, rose simultaneously from 4 disguised container barges anchored in the northern traffic separation scheme. These were not the improvised launch platforms Iran had used in 2024. Each barge had been positioned under commercial cover over a 3-week period, their Shahid payloads concealed inside standard 40-foot ISO containers fitted with hydraulic lid-lifting mechanisms and a fiber-optic command wire running 12 kilometers to a hardened AC control node buried under the Hormuz City Port Authority building. The containers opened in 1.8 seconds. The Shahid 195s were airborne in 4.2 seconds, flying in a low-altitude spread formation at 285 kilometers per hour. They descended to 8 meters above the wave surface, below the effective radar horizon of every U.S. surface combatant in the immediate area, and began executing a coordinated saturation ingress pattern targeting the Abraham Lincoln's electronic sensor nodes rather than her hull. This was the lesson Iran had learned from the January engagement. Don't try to sink the carrier. Blind it. Simultaneously. And this is the detail that left the Joint Chiefs of Staff speechless when they reviewed the engagement timeline 14 hours later. The IRGC's 1st Electronic Warfare Battalion on Hengam Island activated the Kasta 2E2 radar jamming complex, a system Iran had quietly acquired through a sanctions-busting shell network in Belarus, and upgraded with domestically produced AI-driven frequency-hopping software. The Kasta 2E2 didn't simply broadcast noise across the electromagnetic spectrum. It learned. In the 0.6 seconds before the Abraham Lincoln's SUIP Block 3 electronic warfare suite could characterize the jamming signal and begin its counter-response cycle, the Kasta system had already profiled the carriers and /SLQ 32V 6 countermeasures architecture and begun generating spoofed Link 16 tactical data feeds, false contact geometries designed to look like genuine radar returns that would inject phantom target tracks directly into the Aegis Combat System's threat picture. If the spoof worked, the Abraham Lincoln Spy 6 radar would see 47 incoming missiles instead of 14. Its VLS cells would waste interceptors against ghosts while the real drones flew through the gap. What would you do if you were the air warfare coordinator aboard the Lincoln right now? Comment 1 if you hold fire and wait for optical confirmation. Comment 2 if you shoot the full interceptor solution and take the risk of running dry. At 0319 hours and 7 seconds, the third kill layer, the one Iran had designed to be the insurance policy, the element that no tactical response could negate without triggering the very environmental catastrophe Washington had specifically ordered its commanders to avoid, went hot. On the northern shoreline of Keshem Island, 22 NOR anti-ship missile launchers elevated their canisters at an 18-degree angle. The NOR is Iran's domestically produced version of the Chinese C-802, a 715-kilogram sea-skimming cruise missile with a 165-kilogram warhead, a terminal phase active radar seeker, and a range of 170 kilometers that put every vessel in the strait well within its effective engagement envelope. But tonight, the NOR batteries were not targeting U.S. warships. Their fire control systems had been uplinked with the precise GPS coordinates of the 3 stranded VLCCs, the Minerva Virgo, the Stina Immortal, and the Al Salam carrier. The IRGC commander's logic was geometrically brutal. If the U.S. Navy attempted to clear the strait by force, by sinking the Shahid drones, by prosecuting the Fateh submarines, by striking the electronic warfare nodes, Iran would fire the NOR battery and sink all 3 tankers. The hydrocarbon fire would seal the strait for weeks. The global economy would convulse. And the blood, Iran calculated, would be on American hands. If the U.S. Navy did nothing, stood down, held its fire, backed away from the ultimatum, the IRGC would announce, on live global television, that the Strait of Hormuz was now closed by sovereign Iranian maritime authority, and that any vessel attempting transit without IRGC approval would be subject to seizure or destruction. Either way, Tehran controlled the board, except for one variable they had failed to account for. At 0318 hours and 44 seconds, 22 seconds after the Shahid drones went airborne and 23 seconds before Iran's tactical commanders believed the U.S. response cycle would begin, AP 8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft operating at 27,000 feet under total Lincoln emissions control, call sign Ironwall 6, relayed a single encrypted data burst to the Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center via EHF SATCOM relay. The data burst contained 3 elements. First, the precise GPS coordinates of all 4 Shahid launch barges, cross-referenced against the AN/APS 154 Advanced Airborne Sensor Radar imagery captured during a covert prepositioning pass 47 minutes earlier. Second, the confirmed acoustic track of all 3 Fateh submarines, triangulated using a passive Dafar sonobuoy net that Ironwall 6 had seated along the southern shipping lane over the preceding 6 hours under cover of simulated routine maritime patrol, a deception operation specifically designed to give the IRGC surveillance units nothing unusual to report. Third, and most critically, the fiber optic command node location, buried 4.2 meters below the Hormuz Port Authority building, that was providing targeting solutions to both the submarine formation and the Noor battery. Cut that node, and the Fateh submarines go acoustically blind. Their torpedo targeting solutions dissolve. The Noor battery's fire control computers lose their GPS uplink and revert to onboard inertial navigation, accurate to approximately 340 meters at the ranges involved. At that CEP, firing at a stationary 330-meter-long VLCC becomes a 60% probability of miss. The entire Iranian kill chain was one fiber optic relay node away from collapse. And the USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class nuclear attack submarine that the Fifth Fleet had positioned inside the Strait 6 days earlier, running at ultra-quiet speed under the thermal layer, her presence completely invisible to IRGC surface surveillance, had been sitting with a firing solution on that exact geographic coordinate for the past 9 hours. At 0319 hours and 31 seconds, USS Connecticut's commanding officer, Commander Elaine Barros, received the execute authorization via ELF burst transmission. The weapon's release took 4 seconds. A single BGM-109E Tomahawk land attack missile, Block V, with terrain countermatching guidance and a 454-kilogram penetrating warhead, launched from Connecticut's Port VLSL, climbed to 180 feet, and immediately dropped back to sea-skimming altitude. It flew the 14-kilometer distance to the Hormuz Port Authority building in 41 seconds. The penetrating warhead drove through 3.8 meters of reinforced concrete before detonating. The explosion was confined entirely to the subsurface node infrastructure. From the surface, it looked like a minor gas line rupture. From inside the IRGC command network, it looked like the end of the world. At 0320 hours and 12 seconds, exactly 2 minutes and 50 seconds after the Shahid 195 drones had launched, every fire control data link connecting the Fateh submarines to their shore-based targeting computers went dark. The submarines' onboard processing units reverted to autonomous mode, running their own local acoustic contact classification algorithms. But without the shore uplink providing real-time AIS correlation data from the stranded tankers, their fire control computers could no longer distinguish between the acoustic signature of the Minerva Virgo and the acoustic signature of the escort destroyer USS Michael Murphy, which had, at 0318 hours and 55 seconds, begun a high-speed run directly toward the submarine formation at 34 knots. Her hull generating a broadband noise signature specifically calibrated to saturate the Fateh's passive sonar processing. The Fateh submarines hesitated. In submarine combat, hesitation is defeat. At the same time, 2 18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft launched from the Abraham Lincoln's port catapult at 0319 hours and 48 seconds, climbing to 18,000 feet and activating their /ELQ 99F jamming pods. But they were not targeting the Casta 2E2 radar jammer on Hangam Island. They were targeting the Shahid 195 drones directly. The NGGMB next-generation jammer pods operated in a narrow-band directional mode, projecting a focused electromagnetic pulse at the specific frequency band used by the Shahid 195's active radar seekers. The drones didn't explode. They went blind. Their terminal seekers received nothing but white noise. 14 Shahid 195 loitering munitions, each carrying a 35-kilogram shaped charge warhead, continued flying their pre-programmed search patterns for approximately 180 seconds before their fuel exhausted and they impacted the sea surface with a series of small detonations that USS Abraham Lincoln's damage control crews watched from the flight deck with something close to professional satisfaction. 0 aircraft lost. 0 interceptors expended. The entire Iranian drone swarm neutralized by electronic warfare alone, a tactical outcome that had never before been achieved in live combat conditions. Now for the Noor battery. At 0320 hours and 55 seconds, with a fiber optic command node destroyed, the Fateh submarines reverting to defensive positioning, and the Shahid drone swarm dissolving into the sea, the 22 Noor launchers on Keshem Island were still hot, still elevated, still pointed at 3 tankers carrying 700,000 metric tons of crude oil. The IRGC battery commander, cut off from his central command node, had 90 seconds to make a decision before his autonomous launch authorization window expired. He could fire on his own initiative. He could destroy those tankers. He could still seal the strait. But what he did not know, what the IRGC command structure had failed to brief him on, because the intelligence had been buried 6 levels deep in a U.S.-Israeli cyber operation that had penetrated Iran's Artesh network infrastructure 11 days earlier, was that 4F divided by a -18F Super Hornets had been orbiting at 28,000 feet, 80 kilometers west of the strait, since 0245 hours. Each aircraft was armed with 2 AGM-158C long-range anti-ship missiles, the maritime strike variant of JSSMER, with a 900-kilometer range, autonomous target recognition, and a 450-kilogram penetrator warhead capable of destroying a mobile launcher through its armored storage canister. At 0321 hours and 9 seconds, the strike authorization transmitted from 5th Fleet Commander Admiral Sarah Rowe, the first female officer to command the 5th Fleet and a former F/A-18 pilot with 347 carrier landings, was received by the flight lead of Reaper Flight. 8 LRASM missiles were released in a 4-second salvo. They flew at Mach 0.85 at wavetop altitude, autonomous and self-navigating, each one making real-time targeting adjustments based on onboard EO/IR sensor fusion data. The Noor launchers, operating without radar emissions per IRGC passive operation doctrine, had no active air defense radar signatures that could trigger a warning. The IRGC battery crew had 11 seconds from the moment the LRASM seekers locked onto their thermal signatures to the moment the first warhead impacted Launcher Unit 3. All 22 Noor launchers were destroyed in 38 seconds. Not one of them fired. At 0328 hours and 47 seconds, exactly 11 minutes and 25 seconds after Petty Officer Delgado first reported the submerged contacts, the Abraham Lincoln's Combat Information Center received a total threat clear assessment from the Aegis Combat Management System. The 3 Fateh submarines, cut off, blind, and surrounded by the acoustic signature of USS Connecticut's Target Lock active sonar, had initiated emergency ascent and were surfacing under the guns of USS Michael Murphy and USS Farragut. The Strait of Hormuz was open. The 2,000 stranded vessels, their masters standing on bridge wings in the gray pre-dawn light, watching the distant flash of missile impacts on the Keshem shoreline, began slowly to move. In the 5th Fleet CIC, no one cheered. Admiral Rowe stood before the tactical display for a long moment, watching the contact tracks resolve. 3 submarines, 14 drones, 22 launchers, 1 fiber optic node, all neutralized in under 12 minutes with 0 U.S. casualties and 0 civilian vessel damage. She turned to her operations officer and said 2 words, "Not yet," because the satellite uplink from the National Reconnaissance Office had just refreshed, and what it showed in the port of Bandar Abbas, 90 kilometers up the Iranian coast, was not a defeated navy standing down. It was a fleet preparing to surge. 12 Sina-class fast attack craft, 4 Hodon-class missile boats, 2 more Fateh submarines at the pier, deck crew running. The IRGC Navy wasn't retreating. It was reloading. The engagement the world had just watched, the clean, controlled, 11-minute response that had prevented an environmental catastrophe and preserved freedom of navigation through the world's most critical choke point, had been Phase 1. Phase 2 was already in the water. And Phase 2 didn't care about the rules that had just kept Phase 1 from becoming a war. The strait is open today, but the hands that try to close it are still on the trigger. The 2026 Iran war did not end at 0328 hours on March 25th. It simply paused long enough to ask one question, the same question that every admiral, every president, And every civilian watching commodity markets collapse has been asking since February 28th. How long before the next 11 minutes runs out of miracles? In your assessment, with the IRGC's second surge fleet now underway and U.S. VLS cells partially depleted from 26 days of sustained strike operations, does the Fifth Fleet have enough depth to fight a third engagement in the Strait without drawing in two strikes on Bandar Abbas itself, an escalation threshold that would almost certainly trigger Iranian ballistic missile launches against U.S. bases in Qatar and Bahrain? Share your analysis below, because the next classified brief on Operation Ironwall drops in our next video. And trust me, what the Pentagon decided to do about those Fateh submarines is something you are absolutely not going to see in any mainstream news report. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Because in this war, the window between information and irrelevance is measured in minutes.